Night begins the way all holy things do, with a whisper that pretends to be a revelation, but is really just the wind forgetting its manners. And in that dim corridor of time, between the first sigh of the moon and the last complaint of the day, you find yourself here, listening to a tale soaked in candle smoke and medieval irony. A tale about fear, priests, and the kind of piety that rattles more than it reassures. It begins with a single, heavy question, a question older than any cathedral door hinge. Why did medieval women fear priests? Not dislike, not avoid, not merely raise an eyebrow at. No, fear. A sacred, trembling, bone-deep kind of fear. As if standing before a holy man was like standing before a particularly judgmental raven with a very long memory. And of course, the moment you ask such a question, the universe responds in its usual helpful way, by offering not answers, but 12 new confusions, 3 omens, and 1 faint smell of incense that refuses to go away. But listen closer, because this is not a story of scandal. Oh, no. Scandal is too easy. This is a story of shadows draped over sanctity, and sanctity draped over human absurdity, and human absurdity draped over someone trying desperately to look spiritual while tripping over their own robe. It is comedy, disguised as philosophy, disguised as theology, disguised as an apology that no one asked for. And as you sink deeper into this candle-lit labyrinth, you will notice, almost reluctantly, an irony curling at the edges of every scene. Not the cute kind of irony you use when you run into your ex at the bakery. No, this is the medieval kind, the kind that has read too many saints' biographies and concluded that humans only become holy by accident or exhaustion. So breathe slowly. Let the dust settle on your eyelashes. Let the faint memory of old parchment flutter inside you like some papery moth trying to convert itself. Let the darkness around you stretch and yawn, as if settling in for a story it already knows but wants to hear again, because even the darkness, poor thing, likes a bit of gossip. Our tale begins in a village where the nights were so long and the candles so short that people often confused themselves for saints just because they were standing in good lighting. A village where confessionals creaked like guilty ribs, where prayers rose into the air like lost birds, and where women whispered warnings to their daughters about priests, the way people whisper about wolves, except wolves at least had the decency not to knock on your door asking about your soul's well-being. But before you wander too far into judgment, remember this. Medieval priests were not villains, no more than medieval women were helpless lambs. Both were simply human, which is always the most dangerous thing one can be in a religious setting. And fear, real, trembling, bitter chocolate fear, does not blossom from evil alone, but from power mismatched with mystery, from rituals misunderstood, from authority wielded with divine overconfidence. That is the true heart of this tale. Not wickedness, but misunderstanding. A sacred, elaborate, beautifully tragic misunderstanding between those who preach the path to heaven and those who suspected the map was upside down. Picture it. A lone priest walking through a foggy village path at dusk. The air heavy with smoke from hearth fires, the rooftops wearing little hats of ash. He walks not like a man, but like a question, slow, solemn, uncertain whether it wants to be answered. And the women see him in passing, not his face, but his silhouette, and feel their hearts tighten in the way hearts do when they sense something that is holy, yes, but also inconveniently unpredictable. There is nothing more frightening than someone who believes they speak for God, especially when God, for reasons unknown, rarely contradicts them audibly. And so a silence grew between the women and the priests, an ornate, embroidered silence filled with embroidered fears, that priests could read minds. They could not. They barely managed their own. That priests could see sin glowing on skin like candlelight. They could not, though they pretended to. That priests carried divine authority in their pockets, like little pebbles they could throw at will. Fear thrives in shadows, and medieval priests cast very long shadows indeed. And you, dear listener, may wonder, what kind of fear? What did these women truly feel? Ah, but that is what the next 11 parts are for. Tonight, in this first long drift of narrative incense, we begin only with the fragrance of the mystery, not its body. Still, before the night unspools further, allow me to offer you a blessing of sorts, ironic, gentle, algorithmic, because stories, like prayers, demand a ritual. Before you settle in pretending this is just background noise, do the holy thing, like the video and subscribe. Only if you feel called by the algorithmic divine, of course. Now breathe. The night is only beginning. The candle has a long way to burn. And fear, oh sweet, medieval fear has so many stories left to tell. Night has a way of introducing worlds the same way monks introduce sermons, slowly, dramatically, and with a confidence that is only sometimes justified. And so, let us step quietly, reverently, ironically, into the world where our protagonist lived long before she realized she had become the protagonist of anything. Because no medieval woman ever woke up thinking, "Today I shall become a symbol of spiritual contradiction." No. Most woke up thinking about bread, or cold, or why the rooster was screaming again, or whether God might consider inventing mornings that begin slightly later. Her name, at least the one whispered in the village dust, was Alara. A soft name, gentle as the feather of a saint's quill, but carrying beneath it a sturdiness you only acquire after surviving winters, sermons, and neighbors with unsolicited opinions. Alara lived in a place that was not quite a town, not quite a village, not quite important enough for cartographers to bother with. A cluster of homes stitched together by mud, smoke, and mutual suspicion. A place where the air always smelled faintly of old wool, burning wood, and sins best left unspoken. The monastery loomed on the hill above the settlement, not ominously, but inconveniently, like a relative who has come to stay indefinitely. It cast a long square-shaped shadow every morning, and an equally sanctimonious one every afternoon. Its bells rang at hours designed specifically to annoy the human spirit. The monks swore it was to call the faithful to prayer. The women said it was to remind them of guilt they weren't currently feeling, but soon would. Alara lived close enough to hear the bells breathe, but far enough to pretend she didn't. Her home was a modest wooden structure, the kind that creaked when it was cold and groaned when it was warm. Its walls were decorated not with art. Art was a luxury reserved for churches and people who claimed direct correspondence with angels, but with the simple tools of surviving medieval life: baskets, dried herbs, a stool that wobbled because the carpenter was a poet at heart and therefore terrible at measurements. Every morning, Alara rose before the sun did, because the sun, unlike medieval women, had the privilege of sleeping in. She wrapped her wool shawl around her shoulders like a small, personal cathedral and stepped outside into the crisp air. Dew touched her ankles. Smoke from distant hearths brushed her face. A rooster crowed with the intensity of someone deeply committed to his job. And somewhere, faintly, a monk was already coughing, preparing his lungs for a day of chanting, which was essentially dignified coughing with rhythm. The village path was a muddy ribbon that stretched through the fields, past the stone well, and all the way to the monastery door. Elara walked it often, though never without a quiet internal debate about whether the trip was spiritually worth the blisters. She fetched water from the well, greeted her neighbors with nods steeped in shared responsibility, and listened, oh yes, listened, to the gossip drifting like incense, half true, half wild, and entirely essential to communal survival. It was on one such morning, wrapped in cold mist and mild regret, that Elara first noticed the priest. Not a priest. There were several of those breeding in the monastery like holy rabbits, but the priest, the one women avoided without appearing to avoid him. His name was Father Aldrich. He wore the same expression day after day, as if sculpted into permanent concern. His robe always had one more stain than yesterday, and he walked like someone haunted not by demons, but by paperwork. The women lowered their gazes when he approached, not out of piety. Piety was saved for Sundays, but out of practicality. If you made eye contact, he might start speaking about the state of your soul. And medieval souls were fragile things, constantly cracking under the pressure of climate, marriage, hunger, plagues, or just existing. No one wanted a surprise evaluation. Elara, however, being stubborn by nature and philosophical by accident, did the opposite. She lifted her eyes, and for a moment, just a heartbeat, a flicker, a single flap of an angel's exhausted wing, she saw something in him. A shadow, a sorrow, a burden? Or perhaps merely the universal exhaustion of someone who has heard too many confessions about insignificant sins but must pretend they are meaningful. But this is not a story about a priest. Not yet. This is a story about the world that shaped the fear, the rituals that fed it, the walls that echoed it, the mornings that whispered it like a warning wrapped in wool. The village women, for example, had a peculiar habit. Whenever a priest walked by, they clutched their shawls closer around their chests. It was not modesty. Modesty was already baked into them like flour into bread. No, this was something older, instinctive, ancestral, like the memory of lightning passed down through generations. When asked why, the women always gave the same answer. You never know what priests can sense. And it was true in a way. Priests had an unsettling ability to appear when least wanted and interpret things that did not need interpreting. They saw sins where there were none, guilt where there was indigestion, temptation where there was boredom. Elara knew all this, of course. Every woman did. It was part of the inheritance, like cheekbones or curses. But unlike the others, she did not feel fear. Not fully. Not yet. There was curiosity in her instead. A dangerous curiosity, the kind that leads people into philosophical trouble. And so, as the day unfolded, she moved through her world with the ease of someone paying attention to everything and pretending to pay attention to nothing. The river murmured nearby like a philosopher who only speaks in metaphors. Children chased each other with sticks that pretended to be swords. Men repaired roofs with the confidence of people who believed they would not regret their craftsmanship tomorrow. Life, in all its medieval stubbornness, persisted. At midday, sunlight poured through the clouds like molten gold, briefly, dramatically, as if God had opened a window just to check if anyone was misbehaving. Elara sat near the well, washing vegetables and pondering, as always, the great mysteries of existence. Why did the earth feel tired today? Why did bread rise differently depending on her mood? And why did priests insist on walking around with the air of men who had read the ending of the universe and were unimpressed? She did not realize she was being watched. Not by a priest, thankfully, but by Martha, the village midwife, a woman who saw everything, including the things people wished she hadn't. Martha approached with the stealth of someone accustomed to secrets. "You looked at Father Aldrich this morning," Martha whispered, as if confessing a crime. Elara blinked. "He walked in front of me. Should I have closed my eyes?" Martha gasped theatrically. "Don't joke about these things. He'll think you have questions." Elara tilted her head. "About what?" "About God," Martha hissed. "Theology, salvation, the usual dangerous ideas." "Dangerous?" Elara echoed. "Oh, yes, very dangerous. Priests love women who ask questions. They see it as potential." Elara frowned. She didn't like the word potential. It felt like the kind of word priests use to assign people responsibilities they did not want. But Martha wasn't finished. She leaned closer, lowering her voice until it became a trembling thread. "Don't let them notice you thinking. Women who think too loudly end up in trouble." Elara laughed, a soft, warm sound like a candle coughing. "I've been thinking my whole life." "Yes," Martha sighed, "but quietly. Keep it that way." Then she left, shuffling away with the dramatic weight of someone who believed she had just saved a soul. Elara watched her go, puzzled, amused, and slightly unsettled. It wasn't that she didn't believe Martha. Martha was rarely wrong. It was simply that Elara had never considered that thinking was something priests monitored the way shepherds monitor sheep. Yet as the breeze curled around her, carrying hints of incense from the monastery, she couldn't help but feel a tightening in her chest. A thread pulled taut. A small, delicate awareness. Perhaps her world was not as simple as it appeared. Perhaps the fear whispered among the women had roots deeper than gossip. Roots tangled in power, ritual, and the strange, unspoken rules of religious life. As afternoon faded into evening, Elara walked home under a sky swollen with clouds. The wind hummed through the wheat fields. Ravens perched on fence posts, watching her with black, intelligent eyes. And behind her, the monastery bells began their evening chant, a long, resonant note that vibrated through the air like a warning disguised as a blessing. Elara paused, listening. The sound wrapped around her, heavy and solemn, pressing against her thoughts. She felt, just for a moment, like a thread in some vast tapestry she had not woven. A small figure moving through a world designed by someone who had never met her. And far up on the hill, the priest, Father Aldrich, stood beneath the monastery archway, his silhouette framed against torchlight. Watching. Thinking. Or perhaps simply existing with the unfortunate habit of looking ominous. It was difficult to tell with priests. The world around her was beautiful in its own strange, dusty, contradictory way. But beauty was not comfort, and comfort was not safety. And fear, well, fear had a very particular flavor in this place. A flavor like cold iron, or unspoken truths, or footsteps you hear behind you but cannot name. This was Elara's world. This was the place where her story would unravel. A world shaped by prayers, shadows, and the quiet terror of being seen. And Elara, without realizing it, had already taken her first step into the labyrinth. Before doubt ever dared to lay a finger on Elara's thoughts, before her faith cracked like old paint on a chapel wall, there was a time when she believed. Not fiercely, not passionately, not in the way saints do when they volunteer for martyrdom, as if signing up for a seasonal festival. No, Alara believed the way one believes in the existence of faraway kings, or the honesty of traveling merchants, or the promises of a rooster who swears he will crow at a reasonable hour some day. Her faith was gentle, mild, properly moisturized with routine. It lived in her the way bread lives in dough, present, necessary, but not something she pondered unless it failed to rise. She prayed, of course. Everyone prayed. It was the medieval equivalent of breathing, except more dramatic. But Alara prayed with the quiet resignation of someone brushing crumbs off a table. Respectfully, without urgency, and entirely because society had decided this was the correct way to behave. Each morning, she folded her hands as if preparing them for a polite conversation. She bowed her head not out of divine awe, but because bowing prevented her from seeing the hole in the wall that reminded her the house needed repairs she couldn't afford. And she murmured the familiar words, half memory, half improvisation, just enough to convince heaven she was trying, and enough to convince herself heaven probably appreciated the effort. Her devotion was practical, never flamboyant. She believed in miracles the same way she believed in seasonal discounts at the traveling market. Hopeful, skeptical, and always slightly amused when something actually happened. Sometimes she lit candles, not from piety, but because candles provided warmth and looked less judgmental than priests. And, oh, the smell of beeswax, that warm, golden, forgiving fragrance that seemed to whisper, even if your soul is crooked, at least your lighting is excellent. When she walked by the chapel, she always dipped her head, though she wasn't entirely sure if she was greeting God or simply avoiding the gaze of the carved wooden angel, who watched everyone with the expression of a disappointed librarian. Her faith was not an ocean. It was a small pond, calm, shallow, reflective, and occasionally visited by ducks. It wasn't strong enough to move mountains, but it was steady enough to hold her life together. A quiet companion, a warm cloak, a slightly unreliable but well-meaning friend. She believed because everyone believed. It was as natural as calluses, as communal as bread shared at dusk, as expected as the gossip Martha delivered every Thursday as if it were communion. And yet, beneath that gentle faith lay something else, something more fragile, like a thin sheet of parchment left near a candle flame, a longing, a question, a soft, unarticulated ache. She wanted to feel something, not ecstasy, not divine fireworks, not the kind of visions that made saints wander into forests talking to trees, just reassurance that someone, somewhere, was listening. In the quiet of the night, when all was still except the sighing wooden beams of her house and the crackling of her fire, she would sometimes speak to the darkness, as if addressing a shy deity who refused to make eye contact. "Are you there?" she whispered. Not full prayer, not full doubt, more like checking if the universe had fallen asleep. Her faith was wrapped in silence, not the heavy silence of resignation, but the gentle silence of someone waiting for footsteps that never quite arrive, the kind of silence that could easily turn into poetry or collapse into laughter. And yet Alara was not tormented. She was not desperate. She was not seeking revelation. She practiced her faith like one tends to a garden, with patience, familiarity, and mild confusion. Most days, she suspected she was watering weeds but kept going because the process felt grounding. She attended Mass each week, sitting in the pew, with the posture of a student pretending to take notes. Father Aldrich preached with the dramatic flair of a man who wished he had been born a prophet, but had settled for being a particularly enthusiastic messenger. He spoke of sin, salvation, divine wrath, divine love, divine confusion, Though he didn't call it confusion, he called it mystery, which is the Church's elegant word for "we're not fully sure either." Elara listened kindly, nodding at intervals, letting the words slide into her mind like incense smoke. Present, fragrant, and impossible to hold. She liked certain parts of faith, the chants that made the air tremble, the smell of incense, thick as dreams, the way candles flickered as if whispering secrets in a language only flame understood. The idea, romantic, foolish, irresistible, that her small life might be connected to something vast and shimmering. Yes, Elara believed. Not with fire, not with thunder, but with a kind of polite fondness. Her faith was a well-worn cloak, comfortable, familiar, slightly frayed, but undeniably hers. And she believed in priests, too, in the vaguely respectful way one believes in healers, shepherds, or distant bureaucrats. They were holy men, important, close to God, or at least closer than the rest of them, like neighbors who live one floor below heaven and occasionally peek through the floorboards to report what they see. She admired their chanting, though she wondered why it always sounded like they were confronting an existential crisis mid-hymn. She respected their vows, though she suspected many monks accepted celibacy only because they genuinely disliked people. She honored their knowledge of Scripture, though she found it curious how confidently they interpreted metaphors written by prophets, who probably didn't mean half the things priests claimed they meant. But even in her admiration, there was a thread of distance, a soft boundary drawn instinctively. Priests, after all, were like fire, warm, illuminating, but occasionally prone to setting things on fire without warning. Her mother, before passing into whatever realm accepts women who have survived childbearing, droughts, and husbands with theological opinions, told her once, "Priests are instruments of God, dear. Precision instruments, like knives." Elara asked her then, very calmly, "Do knives feel compassion?" Her mother answered equally calmly, "Only when dull." Elara carried that phrase inside her heart ever since, not as fear, but as wisdom wrapped in irony. Still, she had never felt threatened by priests, disturbed once or twice, overwhelmed occasionally, slightly puzzled often, but never threatened. Not truly. Her faith shielded her from the edges of their authority. Her routines anchored her. Her inner humor kept her lit from within. And oh, her humor. Elara was not loud, but her mind sparkled like a candle, trying to impersonate a star. She saw contradictions with gentle amusement. She listened to solemn sermons and translated them automatically into more practical language. When Father Aldrich warned the congregation that the devil prowls like a hungry beast, she quietly wondered if the devil had ever considered a vegetarian diet. But this, too, was part of her faith, the ability to laugh at its excesses, to find tenderness in its flaws, to love it as one loves a slightly confused but well-intentioned pet. Her devotion wasn't dramatic because she didn't need it to be. Faith didn't fill a void. She didn't have one large enough to demand miracles. Faith didn't heal wounds. She was not wounded in a way prayer could solve. Faith didn't promise answers. She didn't ask questions loud enough for the heavens to hear. She believed because belief was the language her world spoke, and she spoke it fluently, though not fluently enough to avoid grammatical errors of the soul. The truth is this: Elara's faith had never been challenged deeply, not by tragedy, not by betrayal, not by visions or dreams or divine disappointments. Her faith had been allowed to exist untouched, untested, like a vase placed on a high shelf, dusty, decorative, structurally sound because no one had bumped into it. But life, especially spiritual life, has a way of introducing elbows, of nudging shelves, of testing the stability of things we assume will hold forever. And Ilara's vase was about to fall, not because she stopped believing, not because she wanted to, but because belief, when shaken, reveals its cracks. She had no idea that her gentle, practical, pleasantly mediocre faith was headed toward rupture. She had no warning, no prophecy, no whisper from the beyond. Just a quiet world, a quiet heart, and a quiet faith, each about to be stirred like ashes in a sudden wind. Her world was changing, her faith was shifting, and the first seeds of doubt were gathering just beyond the horizon, unseen, uninvited, inevitable. But for now, in this part of the story, all is still, all is calm, all is deceptively whole. This was Ilara before the storm, before the cracks, before the unraveling. This was her faith, soft as wool, steady as breath, unquestioned as sunrise. A faith ready to break, and ready, too, to reveal what lay beneath. Doubt never enters through the front door. It does not knock. It does not bow. It does not introduce itself like a polite theological visitor holding a scroll of questions. Doubt prefers the cracks, the dim corners, the loose stones of the mind, the places where certainty is a little too tired to keep watch. And so it was with Ilara. Her faith, so gentle and routine-driven, did not shatter with thunder or visions or celestial reprimands. No, the first seed of doubt came quietly, like a single snowflake landing on warm skin, melting, almost disappearing, but leaving behind the faint memory that something touched you. It began on a night soaked in fog, the kind of fog that rolls over the earth like a monk spreading ashes with deliberate elegance. The moon was shy, hiding behind layers of cloud as if refusing to be implicated in anything happening below. The village was still. Lanterns flickered like exhausted souls. Even the owls hesitated to hoot, out of courtesy, perhaps, or out of respect for whatever ancient things listen in the dark. Ilara couldn't sleep, not because she was troubled, but because the night had the irritating habit of reminding her that she owned thoughts she had neglected during the day. She tossed. She turned. She wrestled with her blanket as one wrestles with theological questions, respectfully, but with growing suspicion. Finally, she stood and lit a single candle. Its flame wavered weakly, as if unsure whether it wanted to exist. The light spread softly over the room, wooden beams, dried herbs hanging like old confessions, a clay bowl, a stool whose wobble had achieved spiritual symbolism by this point. Nothing unusual, nothing ominous. And yet, something tugged at her attention. A sound, a whisper, a soft breath that was not hers. She paused, tilted her head, listened. It came again. Faint, distant, almost apologetic. Ilara wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and stepped outside. The night embraced her with cold arms. The fog curtained the world in white, transforming familiar shapes into biblical metaphors. The monastery bells were silent, heavy, asleep. Then she heard it clearly. A voice, from somewhere near the old well, a man's voice, murmuring, insistent, desperate. She approached with caution. The well had a history, not of ghosts or tragedies, but of echoing inconvenient conversations at the worst moments. It was shaped like a stone throat, a swallowing sound only to spit it back at the wrong time. But tonight, its echo was gentle, almost reverent. The voice belonged to Father Aldrich. He was alone, hood lowered, standing beside the well as though delivering a confession to the earth itself. Ilara froze in the shadows, heart pounding not from fear, but from the sudden feeling of witnessing something she wasn't meant to hear. Father Aldrich whispered, "Show me something, anything, a sign, a sound, a spark. I do not ask for clarity, only for presence. He waited. Silence. Even the fog held its breath. Elara felt a pinch of surprise, as if the universe had just tripped on its own script. Priests, after all, were supposed to be spiritual experts, confident, illuminated, serenely smug. They were not supposed to stand alone at wells begging the divine for customer support. Aldrich tried again, voice cracking slightly. Just one answer. One moment where I'm certain you're there. I speak for you all day. Surely you could speak to me at least once. The fog swirled. Nothing. Even the insects decided to remain silent. Elara felt the first tremor of something unfamiliar. Empathy woven with confusion. Wasn't the priest supposed to be the one who knew? The one who had his answers neatly arranged like holy tools on a shelf? Aldrich bowed his head, defeated, and whispered, "Why is your silence so loud?" Elara felt that question seep into her like cold water. Why indeed? She backed away slowly, careful not to disturb him, careful not to let her mind trip over the implications. She returned to her home as if walking through a dream too fragile to interpret, too heavy to ignore. Inside, she sat on her stool. The candle flickered. Her heart flickered too. She did not doubt God. Not yet. But something shifted. A thought she had never allowed herself to consider fully, because it was impolite, inconvenient, and possibly heretical, rose gently to the surface. What if priests don't know either? The idea unsettled her. Not like a nightmare, but like discovering your father doesn't know how to tie certain knots, or that an elder occasionally forgets the moral of their own stories. Realizing priests struggled with faith felt like discovering the village blacksmith was terrified of horses. It didn't ruin trust, but it made trust complicated. The next morning, the world behaved as usual, ruthlessly ordinary. Sunlight spilled over the village like liquid gold poured by a distracted apprentice. Children ran barefoot. Chickens strutted with unjustified confidence. Martha gossiped with the enthusiasm of a woman who believed gossip prevented plagues. Elara tried to behave normally too, but the seed was there now, restless, warm, growing. Small things began to slip through her awareness with sharper meaning. For instance, during Mass, Father Aldrich's voice trembled on the phrase, "We trust in your unwavering presence." It was subtle, but Elara heard it, perhaps because she had overheard the night, perhaps because her ears were now attuned to the delicate fractures in things once assumed whole. Later that day, while gathering herbs in the forest, she found a crow perched on a branch, staring at her with unnerving intelligence. She stared back. The crow cocked its head as if evaluating her spiritual condition. "Do you know?" she whispered. The crow blinked. For a moment, she almost felt as though it would answer. A word, a sign, a mystical feathered insight into the mechanics of God. But no, it cawed, a sound halfway between "I understand" and "you're ridiculous." Elara sighed. That's fair. When she returned home, she found an old parchment tucked under her door, a sermon copy written by Father Aldrich's hand, used for last week's Mass. Its ending was different than what he'd said aloud. Scribbled in rushed ink, he had written, "Do I speak to them, or do I speak to myself, hoping you might overhear?" Elara wasn't supposed to see it, but now she had. And once you see a crack, the wall is never the same. That night, she couldn't sleep again. Thoughts circled her like impatient saints, tapping her shoulders, whispering, nudging. She tried to pray, but the words felt heavier. She tried to breathe, but breath carried questions now. Finally, she whispered into the dark, "Are you there?" The silence, as usual, offered no clarification, but now it felt different. Not comforting, not insulting, just ambiguous. Was it divine mystery or divine absence, or simply the acoustics of a poorly insulated medieval house? She didn't know. She wanted to laugh, because the irony was absurd. She had spent her life believing priests whispered secrets into the ears of heaven, and now she suspected heaven was just as confused as the rest of them. Eventually, she slept, and she dreamed. In her dream, she stood inside a massive cathedral built entirely of fog. Every pillar shifted. Every stained glass window dissolved and reformed. Candles flickered with flames shaped like question marks. She walked down the aisle, footsteps echoing like confessions. At the altar stood a figure draped in shadows. Ilara approached. The figure raised its head and whispered, "I can only answer questions that have answers." She awoke with a gasp, cold, sweating, heart racing, but the room was still, as if nothing had happened, as if dreams were merely night's way of rearranging the furniture of the mind, irritating, revealing, and impossible to ignore. By the next morning, the seed of doubt was no longer a seed. It was a sprout, a small green thing growing quietly through the stone floor of her certainty. It was not painful yet, not frightening yet, just present. And presence, she would soon learn, is sometimes more disruptive than absence. This was the beginning, the first crack, the softest tremor, the whisper behind the well, the crow's unreadable stare, the altered sermon, the dream that spoke in riddles. This was how doubt came to Ilara, not as a storm, but as a gentle, persistent knock against the locked door of her faith. And she, without knowing it fully, had already begun to open. There comes a moment in every spiritual unraveling when the soul, alarmed by its own tremors, abruptly decides to pretend nothing is happening. A reflex as ancient as prayer, a defense mechanism older than theology itself. The mind senses a crack and immediately decorates it with flowers. This was Ilara's state of being the morning after doubt first brushed her thoughts with cold fingers. She woke up determined, furiously, desperately determined to believe she had imagined everything. The priest whispering to the well? A trick of acoustics? The altered sermon? A misread scrawl? The dream cathedral of fog? Too much evening stew? And the silence of God? Ah, well, silence could mean many things, some holy, some mysterious, some simply poor divine scheduling. So Ilara rose from her straw bed with the dramatic enthusiasm of someone attempting to spiritually reboot herself. "I will not doubt," she announced to the empty room, accidentally sounding like a general preparing his troops for an unwinnable war. The herbs hanging from the rafters swayed gently, as if murmuring, "We've heard that one before." She ignored them. Instead, she marched to her small wooden table, set her candle upright, and prayed with a level of intensity normally reserved for people trying to impress visiting bishops. "Oh, Lord," she began, "I am here, willing, ready, faithful, and not confused in the slightest." She paused. That last part had sounded slightly defensive. She continued anyway, voice bright with forced serenity. "Guide my thoughts toward clarity, order, and absolutely no existential crises today, please." Her prayer, if one could call it that, had the tone of a person speaking to a supervisor while pretending not to notice the supervisor has no idea what they're doing either. She exhaled deeply when she finished, chest puffed with pride. There, she thought. Doubt defeated, crisis avoided, faith restored by sheer willpower and excessive articulation. Little did she know, of course, that faith does not respond well to being strong-armed. It is like a cat, affectionate when it chooses to be, offended when you try too hard. Still, Ilara stepped outside with a boldness bordering on reckless optimism. The sun was bright, mockingly bright. The sky a crisp, unblemished blue. Birds chirped with insulting cheerfulness. Even the mud on the path seemed to gleam as though the universe had put on its best face just to encourage Ilara in her delusion. She walked with her chin high, her shawl tightly wrapped, and a smile so composed it looked suspicious. She was determined to be devout today. Radiantly devout. Miraculously devout. The kind of devout that would make saints sigh and say, "Tone it down." As she approached the well, she paused, not because she was remembering Aldrich's nighttime whispering, but because the foggy memory tried to poke her. She swatted it away like a mosquito of the soul. "No," she muttered, "we're not doing that today." She threw the bucket into the well with unnecessary flourish. The splash echoed loudly, as if mocking her attempt at spiritual gymnastics. Her neighbor, old Heron, limped by and squinted at her. "You're smiling too much. Are you unwell?" "I am extremely well," she responded, forcing her smile even wider. Heron grunted. "Sounds like a fever." She ignored him, too. When she returned home, she doubled down on her efforts. She opened her prayer book, the one with fraying edges and ink smudges that looked like tiny divine accidents, and read passages with an exaggerated reverence that would have made angels raise their eyebrows. "Oh, sacred words," she whispered dramatically, "I take thee into my heart." The book, unimpressed, flopped shut due to gravity. Ilara decided she needed chores. Yes, chores always stabilized her faith. She cleaned the table with ceremonial grandeur, swept the floor as if preparing for a holy procession, arranged the herbs in alphabetical order, a system she invented and immediately regretted. She even polished her single metal cup until her reflection appeared distorted enough to resemble a saint undergoing spiritual renovation. But then, disaster struck. She found the altered sermon again. The parchment had somehow slipped from its hiding place, now lying there on her table like a guilty truth. She picked it up, hands stiffening. The ink glared at her. "Do I speak to them, or do I speak to myself, hoping you might overhear?" She inhaled sharply. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no. We're ignoring this. This is irrelevant. This is theological scrap paper." She folded the parchment, and folded it again, and again. She folded it until it was a cramped little cube of priestly despair. Then she hid it under a jar of dried rosemary. "There," she said aloud. "Problem solved." But her voice quivered just enough to betray her. She needed something more dramatic. And so she hurried to the chapel. The chapel glowed with soft candlelight. The air thick with incense, so heavy it could almost be chewed. The carved saints along the walls watched her with expressions that ranged from stoic concern to mild amusement. She approached the altar with the calculated enthusiasm of someone overcompensating. "Hello," she whispered to God, as if addressing a shy neighbor. Then, realizing how strange that sounded, she tried again, louder. "Hello." Her voice echoed through the chapel, startling a mouse away from a dropped piece of bread. She knelt, hands clasped tightly, shoulders rigid, spine straight enough to qualify as architectural support. "Listen," she began, exhaling. "I think there has been some misunderstanding. I am fine. I am steady. I am not doubting anything whatsoever. I am just clarifying that I am absolutely, not even for a moment, concerned about the event at the well." She froze. She had not meant to mention it. The air around her thickened, like a silence leaning forward. She tried again, panicked. "I mean, I wasn't concerned. I am not concerned. It was—" Nothing. Truly. Completely ordinary for priests to talk to wells. A candle flickered violently as though stifling a laugh. Elara sighed, gripping her robe. If you could just give me something today, a sign. A small one, very small, preferably obvious, and ideally flattering. She waited. Silence. A deep, resonant silence, the kind that feels like it has opinions. She clenched her jaw. Fine. If you won't speak, I will. So she prayed harder, louder, faster. She prayed with the fervor of someone trying to drown out their own thoughts. She prayed until her throat ached, until her knees screamed, until even the altar seemed embarrassed for her. One of the monks entered the chapel, saw her, and immediately retreated, likely assuming she was in the middle of a spiritual meltdown he wanted no responsibility for. By midday, Elara left the chapel trembling with forced serenity. She convinced herself that God had answered her, not audibly, not visibly, but through the peaceful feeling of exhaustion. "I am renewed," she whispered. She was lying, of course, but beautifully so. Like all good medieval believers, she assumed that if she smiled strongly enough, the universe would assume she still believed. Her afternoon was a masterpiece of denial. She overblessed her bread. She thanked God excessively for sunlight. She crossed herself whenever a shadow moved. She nodded at the sky with the desperate cheerfulness of a woman pretending her theological foundation was not cracking like an old roof tile. And yet, doubt was still there, like smoke in the walls, like a whisper trapped inside her ribs. That night, she tried one last tactic, convincing herself through over-the-top ritual. She lit every candle she owned, placed them in a perfect circle, sat in the middle, hands cupped like an offering, then began reciting prayers as though auditioning for the role of saint with most dramatic devotion. Her voice echoed beautifully. Her posture was divine. Her sincerity was debatable. At one point, she said, "I am certain," with such intensity that the flame of the nearest candle actually recoiled. She kept going, tears gathering from sheer physical strain, until finally her voice cracked into a whisper. "I believe. I do, mostly." She inhaled sharply at the slip. Mostly. A tiny word, a treacherous word, a word that unravels faith like a thread pulled from a tapestry. Elara collapsed onto the floor, breath trembling. She had prayed, performed, pretended. She had denied her doubt with the force of a woman trying to sweep a storm under a rug. But when she lay there, surrounded by candlelight and exhaustion, she realized something. Negation is not the same as faith. Noise is not the same as certainty. And pretending is simply pretending. She closed her eyes, and in that stillness, her doubt, small, persistent, tender, settled beside her like a shadow finally acknowledged. The denial had failed, brilliantly, spectacularly, inevitably. And the cracks in her faith had begun to widen. There is a particular cruelty in the universe, though cruelty may be too harsh a word. Let us call it a cosmic sense of humor, that reveals itself only when a person is trying to regain spiritual stability. The moment a soul says, "I am calm, centered, and in control," the universe takes this declaration as a personal challenge. And so, as Elara attempted to sober her trembling faith, the cosmos responded by throwing at her the kind of cryptic, unhelpful signs that have led entire civilizations into unnecessary rituals. The first sign arrived at dawn. Elara stepped outside expecting a normal morning. Gray light, cold air, chickens making morally dubious noises. Instead, she found a single feather lying by her doorstep. Not an ordinary feather, not a pretty feather, not even a feather from a species she recognized. It was a strange, smoky gray, speckled with an iridescent sheen that shimmered like a guilty conscience. Elara crouched and touched it. It was warm. Not sun-warmed, but freshly dropped by something uncomfortably mystical. She looked up at the sky. Bare. Empty. Not a single bird. "Wonderful," she muttered. "A magical pigeon has visited me." She picked up the feather, held it between her fingers like a delicate omen, and tried to interpret it. This lasted 4 seconds. "This means absolutely nothing," she concluded, throwing it into a basket of laundry. But the feather weighed on her mind for the next hour like a sacred riddle written by someone bad at metaphors. The universe, pleased with her confusion, offered the second sign shortly after breakfast. As Elara kneaded dough, aggressively, as if disciplining her spiritual doubts through baking, she glanced at the window and noticed the fog behaving. Incorrectly. It wasn't drifting, it wasn't dispersing, it was, she squinted, circling, swirling, very faintly in a spiral shape. A perfect, gentle, celestial spiral. She stared. The spiral tightened, then loosened, then tightened again. She whispered, "If this is a divine sign, it is incredibly passive-aggressive." She rubbed her eyes. Surely it was her imagination. Perhaps she hadn't slept enough. Perhaps the fog was simply bored and expressing itself artistically. Still, she watched it for several minutes, and the fog watched her back, silently, suspiciously, as if deciding whether to reveal a cosmic truth or simply continue being weather. "Stop it," she hissed. "I don't want signs today." The fog ignored her entirely, performing one final graceful swirl before dissolving innocently into the morning air, leaving Elara alone with fresh dough and rising anxiety. She attempted to shake it off, determined to maintain her fragile spiritual equilibrium. But fate, or perhaps a particularly mischievous angel, insisted on sending a third sign. This one involved her bread. When she pulled her loaf from the oven, its crust was burnt in a pattern unmistakably resembling a human face. Not a recognizable face, not a holy face, just a face. Round cheeks, wide eyes, a startled expression as if the loaf itself were shocked by its own spiritual significance. Elara nearly dropped it. "Oh no," she groaned. "Absolutely not. I am not becoming one of those people." She circled the bread, examining it from every angle. The face did not look like Jesus. It did not look like Mary. It did not look like any saint from any fresco. It just looked like a baker who had realized he had overcooked something important. She tapped the loaf. "Are you a sign?" The bread remained stoically silent. She squinted at it. "Or are you simply ugly?" Silence. Annoyed, she took a knife and sliced the bread down the middle. "Let this be the end of your ministry." But of course, the more she tried to dismiss these coincidences, the more the universe doubled down. It was as if the cosmos, sensing her delicate condition, decided to throw every ambiguous omen it had into her path. Midday brought a fourth sign. A raven perched outside her window, staring at her with the expression of someone conducting a theological assessment. Now, ravens stared at people all the time. It was practically their hobby. But this one, oh, this one was different. It tilted its head slowly, then blinked very deliberately, then made a series of clicking sounds that sounded suspiciously like a coded message. "Do not start with me," Elara warned. The raven blinked again. "I mean it." It fluffed its feathers in a gesture that could easily be interpreted as "I have knowledge you lack," or "my wings itch." Hard to say. It hopped closer. Elara stepped back. The raven opened its beak. She braced herself. It cawed, loudly, startlingly, rousily. Then it flew away, leaving behind a single black feather, another one, that drifted down and landed dramatically at her feet. "Oh, good," she groaned. "Another feather of nonsense." She stomped away before the feather could deliver any symbolic meaning. By afternoon, she was overwhelmed. The feather, the fog, the bread, the raven, the sense, unmistakable now, that the universe was engaged in some elaborate theological charade. She paced her home, muttering, "This isn't divine guidance. This is chaos. Ambiguous chaos. Who sends fog as a message? Why bread? Bread is the least helpful spiritual medium. And ravens never say anything useful. Just cryptic staring. Why not send a sign that says, 'Good afternoon, Elara. Here's your clarity.'" She looked up at the ceiling. "I'm talking to beams now. Wonderful. Truly spiritual progress." But the signs weren't finished. The fifth sign arrived unexpectedly, creeping into her day like a monk sneaking extra wine. A whisper. Not the priest's whisper by the well, not a dream whisper, not an imagined whisper. A real, audible, physical whisper. While gathering firewood near the forest edge, Elara heard it, soft, raspy, almost conspiratorial. "Elara." She froze. "Elara." She spun around, heart pounding, eyes wild. Nothing. No figure, no spirit, no person, just trees. Wind. Silence. "Elara." The whisper came again. She dropped her bundle of firewood and raised her hands defensively, though she wasn't sure what one does when fighting a disembodied voice. "Who's there?" she demanded. No answer. "Elara." She gritted her teeth. "Listen, whoever you are, stop it. I am not in the mood for ethereal nonsense." But the whisper, almost amused, breathed one final time. "Listen," then vanished into the trees. Elara stood trembling. A chill ran down her spine. Her heart rattled like a cup on a wobbling table. She hurried home, half running, half praying, all confusion. Inside her tiny house, she pressed her back against the door, as if expecting a ghost to knock politely. "I refuse to consider this a sign," she whispered to herself. "Voices happen. Sometimes. Maybe. Perhaps it was the wind. A very articulate wind." She tried to brew tea to calm herself, but her hand trembled so badly she spilled most of the water, creating a puddle that suspiciously resembled the shape of a chalice. She glared at the puddle. "You are not symbolic." The puddle glistened innocently. By evening, her nerves were shredded. Every shadow looked significant, every sound meaningful, every flickering candle an oracle attempting interpretive dance. She paced, muttering prayers, half-prayers, almost prayers. "If you're trying to send a message," she argued aloud to the sky, "please try literacy, or clarity, or grammar. Silence, of course." As the sun set, she felt the weight of all these non-signs pressing on her chest, too strange to ignore, too absurd to trust. The worst possible combination. She finally sat at her table exhausted. "Just tell me," she whispered to no one and everyone. "What do you want from me?" The candle flickered. She felt tears rise, not from sorrow but from sheer spiritual exasperation. She laughed, a weak, delirious laugh. "I am losing my mind, aren't I?" The silence, generous as ever, offered no opinion. This was the day the universe had chosen to bombard her with signals so unclear they were practically pranks. Nothing was spiritually conclusive. Everything was suspiciously symbolic. And she, poor Elara, was caught between wanting to believe and wanting to throw all feathers, bread, fog, ravens, and whispers into a river. These were the signs that helped nothing, the omens that clarified nothing, the metaphysical riddles that offered no answers. And the worst part, they were only the beginning. There is a moment, small, delicate, traitorous when the human spirit realizes it is no longer standing firmly on the floor of its beliefs, but rather wobbling on an inconvenient theological precipicio. And the moment Ilara reached that edge, the night itself seemed to lean in, eager to witness the spectacle. By now she was surrounded by signs that did not help, omens that clarified nothing, and coincidences that behaved like riddles written by an inattentive god. Her faith, once a calm pond, had become a storm-tossed chalice, sloshing, spilling, trembling with each new whisper of uncertainty. Her descent into spiritual chaos began not with thunder, nor with a divine visitation, nor with a revelation carved in celestial light. No, it began with the most humiliating disaster of all, a failed ritual, and not just any ritual, her mother's ritual, the night of coaxing light, a simple ceremony to bring peace into the home, old, gentle, foolproof. Foolproof, unless, of course, the universe had decided to mock you personally. It started just after sunset. Ilara stood at her small table, which had seen more emotional breakdowns in the past week than bread loaves. She placed her offerings gently, a bowl of spring water, a sprig of lavender, and a small piece of beeswax, traditional items meant to invite serenity. She lit a candle, whispered the customary invocation, "Light of the quiet, keeper of peace, rest in my home as the night finds its breath." Simple, beautiful, harmless. But the candle immediately sputtered, then coughed. Candles should not cough. Then flickered violently as if being interrogated by a particularly hostile wind. Ilara frowned. That's not part of the ritual. The flame bent sideways, then straightened, then bent again, like a monk doing warm-up stretches. Ilara leaned closer. "Stop that!" The flame responded by going out. Just like that. Dead. Extinguished. Gone. Ilara's jaw dropped. "No, no, no, you don't get to do that today." She relit it. It died again. She relit it, holding her breath, shielding it from drafts, whispering encouragement like a desperate mother convincing her child to behave during Mass. It died for the third time. "Unbelievable," she whispered. "Even my candles are doubting." She stared at the wick, at the small wisp of smoke rising like the ghost of her composure. The failed ritual struck her with a strange, disproportionate force. It was not tragic, it was not dangerous, but it was symbolic, insultingly symbolic. This is how it begins, she thought. First the candle rebels, next the walls speak. She tried to steady herself, inhaling deeply, but her breath trembled, and the trembling wasn't only in her lungs, it was in her thoughts, her bones, the fabric of her belief. Her mind, usually a soft and steady place, had become a labyrinth of echoing questions. Why the signs? Why the silence? Why the strange whisper in the forest? Why the priest's confession to the well? Why is everything suddenly meaningful and meaningless at once? She pressed her palms to the table, grounding herself. But grounding, she found, was difficult when the universe seemed intent on lifting her by the ankles. By late evening, her unease had fermented into something thicker, denser, a kind of spiritual nausea. Every creak in her home sounded portentous. Every flicker of candlelight looked conspiratorial. Shadows stretched across her walls like theological arguments that refused to resolve. She sat on her stool. The stool wobbled. Of course it wobbled. It felt like the entire world had joined in her imbalance. When night settled fully, she attempted sleep again. She lay down, closed her eyes, and endured the sudden flood of thoughts that rushed in like invaders. What if my faith is thin? What if I never really believed? What if everything sacred is just misunderstood chaos? What if I am failing God? What if God is failing me? What if neither of us is failing and this is simply how theology works? Messy, confusing, slightly ridiculous. Her mind spun, her stomach twisted, her breath caught. Then she heard it. A knock. A soft knock on her door. A knock at night, when no one, absolutely no one, knocked. Her eyes flew open. She lay still, frozen beneath her blanket. Another knock. Too soft to be threatening, too deliberate to be accidental. She sat up slowly. The candle next to her bed flickered as if nervous. She approached the door, each step measured, silent, careful, like a monk sneaking contraband bread at midnight. She pressed her ear against the wood. "Hello," she whispered. No answer. "Ilara," she gasped and stepped back. It was the voice from the forest, the same tone, the same rasp, the same unsettling intimacy. Her heart pounded like a drum used to summon saints or scare demons. "Ilara!" This time, the whisper seeped into her house without the door opening, as if the walls themselves had softened to let it in. And that's when she felt it. A shift in the air, a pressure behind her eyes, a trembling in her fingertips. Fear crept up her spine, not just the fear of the unknown, but the fear of meaning. Because suddenly, everything had meaning. The feather, the fog spiral, the bread's burnt face, the raven, the whisper, the candle refusing to stay lit. Her mind jogged in circles, desperate to outrun the growing panic. It's nothing. It's something. It's nothing trying to be something. It's something pretending to be nothing. It's madness. It's divine. It's both. It's neither. "Ilara." The whisper came again. She grabbed the nearest object, a broom. A broom, yes. Truly a formidable weapon against supernatural occurrences. "Show yourself," she demanded, though her voice shook. Silence. Then, a light knock on the window. She spun around. The window was open just a crack. She hadn't opened it earlier. A breeze slipped through, carrying cold and the scent of damp earth. Then the curtain fluttered. Then the shadow behind it shifted. Then a shape moved. Ilara let out a sound that could best be described as a swallowed scream. She pressed her back against the wall, clutching her broom like a relic capable of banishing existential dread. The shadow shifted again, closer, taller, more tangible. Ilara. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it vanished. Gone. Disappeared. The whisper evaporated. The air stilled. The curtain settled. Her home looked perfectly ordinary again, as if nothing strange had occurred, as if her fear were simply an unnecessary flourish in an otherwise uneventful night. Ilara stood there shaking, not from terror alone, but from the realization that something inside her had broken. Not shattered, just broken enough to no longer work the same way. Her faith, once the soft pond, had become a whirlpool. Her mind was now a candle being blown out and relit simultaneously. Her spirit trembled like a hymn, sung by someone who forgot the lyrics halfway through. She sank to the floor, knees drawn up, breath shallow. She did not cry. She laughed. A thin, brittle laugh that sounded like a prayer, wrapped in sarcasm. "Wonderful," she whispered. "Now I'm haunted, or blessed, or hallucinating, or all three." She covered her face with her hands. "This is chaos," she muttered, "pure, spiritual chaos." Hours passed before sleep took her. Sleep laced with uneasy dreams that dissolved the moment she woke, leaving only the feeling that she had been running from something she didn't dare name. When dawn finally filtered through her window, she rose slowly, feeling older, thinner, and strangely hollow inside. Her crisis had begun, not as a dramatic collapse, but as a quiet, inexorable sinking, a descent into doubt so thick and intimate that even silence felt like a sermon. And she, Ilara, gentle, steady, practical Ilara, was now standing at the threshold of something vast and terrifying. The terrifying possibility that her faith was not breaking, but transforming. And transformations, she would soon learn, are rarely gentle. There are nights that do not simply arrive, they descend. They press their weight upon the earth like a velvet shroud, suffocating the borders of reason, until the mind becomes a trembling candle flame in a cathedral too vast to illuminate. The night of Ilara's breaking was such a night. It began with wind, but not ordinary wind. No, this wind prowled. It slithered through the cracks of her home like a creature born of silence. It carried with it the scent of faraway storms, the metallic breath of something ancient waking up, stretching its limbs, remembering it once existed. Ilara felt it immediately, a pressure at the base of her throat, a hush inside her ribs, a trembling beneath her skin. It was the kind of uncanny stillness that precedes revelations, or collapses. She sat at her table, the same table that had witnessed her prayers, her denials, her confusion, her quiet unraveling. A single candle burned before her, its flame wavering like a soul with second thoughts. She didn't know why she was awake. She didn't know why her hands shook slightly. She didn't know why every shadow in her house felt like it had pulled up a chair, waiting to see what would happen next. Her thoughts felt stretched thin, like parchment left in the sun too long. Doubt no longer whispered, it hummed. Faith no longer comforted, it itched. Silence no longer rested, it pressed. She exhaled slowly. The candle flickered in sympathy. Something was coming. She could feel it, a shift, a moment, a tearing, a truth, too bright, too sharp, too blunt. Then a sound, not outside, inside. A soft knock, but not on the door this time, on the table. Her breath froze. The candle flame leaned forward as though trying to climb out of the wick. And then she heard it. Tap, tap, tap. 3 knocks. Slow, measured, deliberate. Ilara stared at the table as though expecting it to grow a mouth. "Hello," she whispered. She regretted speaking immediately. The silence after her question was too charged, too substantial, like an animal coiling back before a leap. Then the candle dimmed, just slightly, just enough to make the air colder, and she saw it, a shadow, on the wall, a shadow that did not belong to anything in the room, not her, not the table, not the candle, not any physical object she could name. The shadow stretched upward, tall and thin and impossibly fluid, like a monk made of smoke, swaying in an unseen breeze. The air tightened. The shadow moved. Ilara's heart lunged against her ribs like a trapped bird. "Who?" she began, voice cracking. But the shadow raised an arm, slowly, gracefully, like a choir master preparing a hymn, and extended a single finger toward her. The temperature dropped. Her candle guttered. Her breath turned to mist. And then she heard it. A voice. A voice not like the whisper from the woods, nor the faint rustle she had heard days before. This voice was neither masculine nor feminine, neither near nor far. Neither gentle nor cruel. It simply was. A presence disguised as sound. Ilara! Her name rippled through the air like a stone thrown into water. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. She was pinned, caught between fear and awe, between longing and terror. The shadow leaned closer, and the voice continued. "You asked." Ilara's lips parted. She didn't remember asking anything, but then she did. "Are you there?" She had whispered it in a moment of exhaustion, of doubt, of longing. A question tossed into the void, sent into the night like a paper boat into an unfriendly river. Her knees buckled slightly. She whispered, "I only wanted clarity." The shadow tilted its head. Clarity. a dangerous request. The voice exhaled, yes, exhaled, like a sigh woven from centuries of unanswered prayers. Clarity, it repeated. Alara felt the word vibrate inside her bones. The candlelight danced wildly now, as though trying to flee, but failing. The shadow extended again, closer, deeper, darker, and everything inside her screamed to run, to hide, to collapse. But she didn't. She was rooted by something fierce, something desperate, something unnameable inside her. "What are you?" she whispered. The shadow trembled. The walls seemed to inhale. The wind hissed through the cracks. Then the voice answered, a presence, or an absence wearing a mask, a truth, or a dream, a memory older than faith, or a fear you have fed so well it grew teeth. Alara felt dizzy. She wanted to laugh at the absurdity. She wanted to weep at the beauty. She wanted to faint simply for convenience. Instead, she whispered, "Are you God?" The shadow stilled, utterly, perfectly. Then it laughed. Not a cruel laugh, not a comforting laugh, but a laugh woven with irony deeper than any scripture she had ever heard. "A human question," the voice said, always so eager to define. Alara trembled. "I need to know," she whispered. "No," the voice replied gently. "You want to be comforted." The shadow leaned in until it hovered inches from her face. "And comfort is not clarity." Her throat tightened. Her stomach twisted. Her knees buckled. The shadow shifted again, its outline blurring like ink in water. Then the voice whispered, so softly that even silence leaned closer to hear. "You seek certainty because you fear the vastness. But the vastness is all there is." Alara felt tears prick her eyes, not from fear, but from the unbearable honesty of the words. "And what should I believe?" she asked, voice trembling like a child lost in a cathedral. The shadow's edges rippled. "Believe," it said, "that your questions are older than your answers. Believe that faith is not certainty. Believe that doubt is not failure. Believe that the holy and the absurd share the same bones." She swallowed. The world tilted. Her breath fractured into pieces. Then, as if sensing she stood at the edge of collapse, the presence stepped back, not physically, conceptually. The candle brightened, the air warmed, the shadow thinned, the voice softened. "Alara, you are breaking because you are listening. Most people do not listen. They pray loudly so they cannot hear." Her tears finally fell. She didn't know if she was terrified or enlightened, maybe both. Then, unexpectedly, the voice said, "This moment is the turning." Alara blinked through her tears. The turning? Yes, the moment when belief becomes a choice instead of a habit. Her heart clenched. "And what happens now?" she whispered. The shadow began to fade. "Now," said the voice, "you walk through the silence and decide what you carry out of it." Alara reached out instinctively as though trying to grasp the fading presence, but her hand closed only on air. And then, with a soft, almost sad exhale, the shadow disappeared. Gone. Completely. Utterly. Her home was silent again. The candle stood steady. The walls looked ordinary. The night felt tired. Alara collapsed into her chair, breath shaking through her like wind through old trees. She had broken. Beautifully. Disastrously. Necessarily. And in the breaking, she had glimpsed something. Not God. Not a demon. Not a vision. Not exactly. Something vast. Something ironic. Something tender and terrifying. A truth she did not yet have the language to name. She placed her head in her hands and whispered through trembling breath, "Is this faith or madness?" The silence did not answer. but it felt different now, alive, waiting. She lifted her face, eyes raw. Whatever had visited her, whatever had spoken, hadn't resolved anything. It had simply opened the door. And Alara, whether she liked it or not, had stepped through. Silence, after an encounter with the unexplainable, is not true silence. It has weight, shape, temperature. It clings to the air like incense refusing to dissipate, like a prayer that forgot to leave. The morning after her spiritual rupture, Alara awoke not to birds or sunlight or the rustling of neighbors, but to a thick, almost tangible quiet. It felt as though the entire world had been placed inside a great woolen blanket. Soundless, breathless, wrapped. Her eyes opened slowly, reluctantly, as if they feared what they might see. Nothing unusual. Her tiny home remained precisely what it had always been: cracked beams, clay floor, a lopsided stool, drying herbs hanging from the rafters like defeated saints, a bowl with yesterday's crumbs. Ordinary, comfortingly ordinary. Except nothing inside her felt ordinary anymore. She sat up. Her bones felt heavier. Her breath felt older. Her thoughts, oh, her thoughts, moved like monks in procession, solemn and slow. Last night's presence lingered in her mind like a question etched onto stone. Not terrifying now, not exhilarating, just present, like a bruise that still throbbed but no longer bled. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and stepped outside. The morning was pale, drained of color, as though dawn had risen reluctantly, dragging itself across the horizon like a tired god fulfilling an obligation. Mist blanketed the fields. Dew clung to the grass like cold tears. Smoke drifted from a few chimneys, thin, hesitant, unsure. The world felt muted, not dead, just contemplative, as though it too had seen something it didn't understand. Alara stood there, allowing the cool air to settle around her. The silence seeped into her ears, into her lungs, into the spaces between her thoughts. For a moment, just a moment, she wondered if this was peace, not the peacefulness preached in sermons, but a deeper, quieter, more unsettling peace, the kind that demands you sit with yourself and acknowledge every fracture. She walked toward the well, feet crunching softly on frost-hardened earth. The well, once a source of water and gossip, now looked like an opening into a deeper, darker world. Its stones glistened with moisture. Its rim was cold beneath her touch. She peered inside. Darkness, stillness, the faint echo of distant droplets. Alara whispered, "Are you there?" Her voice did not echo, not even once. The silence swallowed her question immediately, as though refusing to entertain it. She exhaled. "Of course," she murmured. "It figures. If silence could smirk, it would have." She stepped away from the well and began walking through the village. People nodded at her as usual, but she noticed things in their expressions she had never seen before. Lines of tiredness, flashes of doubt, hidden questions tucked behind polite greetings. Had their faces always looked like that? Or had she simply never noticed? Children laughed nearby, chasing a stray dog, but even their laughter sounded muted. A woman stirred a pot over a fire, stirring not only food but unspoken worries. A man repaired a fence, his movements slow, deliberate, as though repairing something else entirely. Life continued, but it felt suspended, held together by threads that trembled. Alara felt strangely apart from it all, not detached, but hovering in a space between participation and observation. Her feet carried her without intention, and soon she found herself near the chapel. The door, heavy, dark, shaped like a coffin turned upright, stood slightly ajar. Candlelight flickered from within, weak and tired. She hesitated. After last night, stepping into a sacred place felt like standing too close to a wound. Still, she entered. The chapel was nearly empty. Only one figure knelt silently near the altar, Father Aldrich. He did not seem to notice her, or perhaps he did and chose not to acknowledge. His shoulders were bowed, posture rigid. His lips moved, but no sound came forth. Alara watched him, unsure of what she was looking for. But then she saw it. His hands trembled, not with cold, not with age, with something much deeper. Fear? Doubt? Desperation? The silence in the chapel was different from the silence outside. Heavier, denser, like a ceiling pressing downward. She stepped closer, her footsteps echoing faintly. Aldrich stiffened slightly at the sound. "Alara," he said quietly, without turning. His voice was rough, scraped raw by sleeplessness. "You shouldn't be here." "Why?" she asked softly. "It is not a good morning." "For whom?" He exhaled shakily. "For anyone who expects answers." Alara felt a small, bitter laugh rise in her throat. "Then I belong here." Aldrich finally looked up. His eyes, usually stern, guarded, disciplined, looked hollow, shadowed, haunted by the weight of prayers that had gone unanswered and truths too heavy to preach. "Alara," he whispered, as though her name itself were a burden. "What happened?" she asked. Aldrich looked toward the altar, and for a heartbeat, Alara thought she saw something in his expression. Fear, awe, or perhaps the quiet exhaustion of someone who had lost an argument with the universe long before dawn. "I prayed," he said simply, and the silence was louder than the prayer. Alara sat beside him. Silence pooled between them, thick as wax. Neither spoke, neither needed to. They were two souls sitting in the aftermath of a storm, unsure whether what they had encountered was divine, delusional, or something in between. After a long while, Aldrich whispered, "Do you ever feel watched?" Alara froze. Then, very slowly, she nodded. Aldrich swallowed. "I thought it was madness," he whispered. "Then I thought it was temptation." His voice faltered. "Now I don't know what to think." Alara's breath trembled. "Something came to me last night." Aldrich turned sharply. "What?" She hesitated. The presence, the shadow, the voice made of silk and stone, the way it spoke of clarity, of vastness, of doubt. She wanted to tell him, to share the weight of the moment, but she saw the tremor in his hands, the fear behind his eyes, and she realized some truths only fracture those not ready to hold them. So instead, she said softly, "I felt something." Aldrich nodded slowly. "That is enough, more than enough." He bowed his head, whispering something that might have been a prayer or a plea for mercy. Alara left him there, swallowed by the chapel's exhausted quiet. Outside, the silence felt colder now, less contemplative, more expectant, as though waiting for her next step. She walked aimlessly for the rest of the day, drifting through the mist-covered fields and along the winding paths that led nowhere in particular. Her thoughts moved like dust in sunlight, glittering, aimless, impossible to gather. She touched leaves, stroked the bark of trees, watched the way shadows moved across the ground. Everything felt different, not holy, not unholy, simply alive with hidden depth. By dusk, she found herself sitting by the river. The water flowed slowly, carrying small branches and fragments of reflection downstream. She watched her face ripple on the surface. Who was she now? Not the steady believer she had been, not fully the doubter she feared becoming. Something in between, a threshold, a hinge, a seam. She dipped her fingers into the cold water. Her reflection broke. reformed, broke again. She whispered, "What am I supposed to do?" The river offered no answer, but the silence around her, the night's deep, aching silence, felt almost like a companion, as though the universe were saying, "Nothing. For now, do nothing. Let the dust settle. Let the questions breathe. Let the silence speak its own language." When she finally returned home, she lit a single candle and sat beside it. She didn't pray, didn't plead, didn't seek. She simply existed, softly, quietly, within the hollowed-out space left behind by her brokenness. And in that hollow space, beneath the ashes of her certainty, something faint began to pulse. Not faith, not clarity, not revelation, but the faintest spark of a new beginning, a beginning wrapped in ambiguity, woven with paradox, resting on the fragile foundation of a silence that felt strangely alive. The thing about revelations is that they are much better in theory than in practice. In sermons, they are clean, radiant, decisive, like thunder with good manners. In real life, they tend to arrive half asleep, smelling faintly of fatigue, hunger, and unresolved trauma. They do not knock, they do not bow, they do not say, "Hello, I am your turning point." They simply slip in and lean against the wall of your mind, smirking. For Alara, the so-called revelation began with something very unspiritual: an empty stomach, 2 days of half meals. One of those village shortages that was not yet a famine, but was already an inconvenience. Bread stretched thinner, soups more water than substance, vegetables resentful of being chopped. The body complained in subtle ways: dizziness, heaviness, the faint feeling that one's bones had become a little theoretical. She woke before dawn with that peculiar hollow ache that is not quite pain, but not quite absence either. Hunger. Yes, but also something else. A spiritual echo inside a physical emptiness. The silence outside was softer today, less oppressive, more resigned. As if the world had accepted that human beings would continue asking questions it had no intention of answering. Alara wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and sat at her table. She didn't reach for her prayer book, didn't light the candle yet. She simply listened, to her own breath, to the distant creak of wood, to her pulse drumming quietly behind her ears like a monk tapping on a closed door. She whispered, not quite a prayer and not quite a complaint, "I am tired of not knowing." Nobody answered. She stood, moved slowly, and prepared a thin meal, a piece of yesterday's bread already too hard, dipped into water to trick her jaw into cooperation. The bread tasted like a sermon, dry, long, and vaguely accusatory. As she chewed, she felt something shift in her chest. Not a voice, not a vision, just a thought. Maybe I have been waiting for God to do what only I am allowed to do. The thought startled her. It felt almost rude. She swallowed her bread too quickly, coughed, and glared at the ceiling as if the rafters might take offense. "I didn't mean that," she muttered. "Probably." But the thought did not leave. It settled, warm, uninvited. Outside, church bells rang, hesitantly, as though even they were unsure of their purpose. It was a feast day, or perhaps a minor holy day, or perhaps a major one. Medieval calendars loved saints the way ravens loved shiny things, excessively and without explanation. The village stirred in response. People straightened their clothes, smoothed their hair, rehearsed their pious faces. Alara did the same, though her pious face had begun to look slightly unconvinced, like someone reading a contract with small print. She walked toward the chapel with the others. The air was cold enough to make her teeth want to chatter, but she kept her jaw tight. Mist curled around ankles. The chapel door, heavy, wooden, unnecessarily dramatic, stood open, candles already burned within, each flame a small, trembling hypothesis. Inside, the familiar smell greeted her: beeswax, incense, stone, breath, the scent of centuries of people trying to understand things they were never promised explanations for. She took her usual place on the worn wooden bench. Martha was nearby, murmuring prayers with the efficiency of someone who had decided long ago that questioning was above her wage. A few rows ahead, a woman held a baby wrapped in wool and quiet desperation. An old man leaned heavily on his cane, as if time itself were pressing down on his shoulders. They were all here for something: forgiveness, comfort, stability, habit. Alara wasn't sure what she was here for anymore. Then Father Aldrich appeared. He stepped into the light with the slow, measured pace of someone who had not slept well in a very long time. His face looked older, the kind of older that does not come from years, but from carrying invisible things: questions, confessions, long nights at wells. He raised his hand, traced the sign of the cross, and began the Mass. His voice was steady, but Alara heard the grain in it, the roughness of overuse and uncertainty. The liturgy flowed as usual: responses, murmurs, gestures, bows. A choreography everyone knew by heart, even if they had forgotten why the dance existed. But then the sermon began, and something tilted. He did not open the usual book of homilies. He did not read from the scrolls prepared by monks with better handwriting and worse imagination. He simply looked at the congregation, eyes tired, mouth tense, as if about to say something he had been forbidden to say in another lifetime. "There are times," Aldrich began, voice low, "when those who serve the altar feel far from it." The room shifted. People stiffened slightly, sensing a breach in the usual script. "There are times," he continued, "when we speak of God more than we speak to God. Times when silence is not a comfort, but a weight." Ilara's heart thumped. Aldrich swallowed, gaze drifting over the rows, not quite settling on her, but not quite avoiding her either. "You pray," he said, addressing them all, "and expect an answer. We—" he pressed a hand to his own chest. "Pray, and often expect none. We teach you certainty, while living with questions we dare not utter too loud." A murmur fluttered through the congregation. A few women glanced at each other. This was not the sermon they had ordered. Ilara stared. Was this about her? About himself? About everyone? Or about no one in particular? Aldrich's voice softened. "We were told," he said, "that faith is a straight road. That doubt is a deviation. That fear is a sign of distance from God. But what if—" He paused, as if listening to something only he could hear. "What if doubt is not the enemy of faith, but its shadow? And what if shadows only exist where there is light?" The chapel went utterly still. Even the candles seemed to lean closer. Alara felt a strange warmth in her chest. Not comfort, not yet, but the beginning of something that resembled recognition. Aldrich went on. "You come to us, confessing, trembling, hoping. You fear our judgment." His eyes rested briefly on a cluster of women. "You fear our power. You fear our words. And you should." A few gasps. Someone dropped a rosary. Aldrich almost smiled, but it was a tired, fractured thing. "You should fear any mortal who claims to hold the keys to your soul, priests included." Ilara's blood ran cold. There it was. The sentence medieval women had always known, but never heard aloud. He continued, "We are not doors to heaven. At best, we are windows. Drafty ones, cracked ones. Sometimes we show you the light. Sometimes we block it." His hands tightened on the pulpit. His knuckles turned pale. "If you have ever feared a priest," he said quietly, "know this. Most of us are simply men terrified of disappointing a God we barely understand." Alara's breath caught. That sounded like an answer, or perhaps a confession, or perhaps just a man unraveling from the inside. Her heart ached with something she couldn't name. Compassion, resentment, relief, all three sat down beside each other at her ribs, arguing quietly. Aldrich cleared his throat, pulling back from whatever edge he'd approached. His expression shifted, just slightly, back toward the familiar mask of clerical composure. "In the end," he concluded, "we all walk in mystery. You, me, the bravest saint, the quietest sinner. Perhaps God speaks. Perhaps God is silence. Perhaps the silence itself is speech. We do not know. We are afraid, and still we kneel." He raised his hand. The sermon was over, officially. But inside Ilara, something had not finished speaking. The Mass continued. Bread lifted, words recited, movements repeated. Bodies knelt and stood like waves in a tide of obedience. Ilara moved with them, but it felt like her limbs were on one side of reality and her mind on the other. When Aldrich raised the host and whispered the sacred words, she watched him closely. His lips moved with precision. His eyes, however, flickered with something older than ritual. A question. And then it happened. The moment. The flicker. The maybe. As he held the host up to the candlelight, Ilara saw, just for a heartbeat, something change. The circle of bread glowed. Not like normal candle reflection. Not like simple brightness. For one impossible instant, it was as though the air around it pulsed, like a heartbeat, like a breath, like the world taking a single sacred gasp. Her own breath stopped. Her vision sharpened. The chapel seemed to blur around the edges. Was it real? Was it trick of light? Her hunger, her exhaustion, her need for something, anything, to mean something again. The glow shifted, wavered, then faded. So quickly she wondered if it had ever been. No one else reacted. No one gasped. No one cried out, "Did you see that?" It was just her. She glanced around, faces blank, tired, reverent, bored, resigned, the usual congregation of souls trying their best. Her heart pounded. Had she just witnessed a miracle? Or an optical illusion? Or a hallucination brought on by hunger and sleeplessness? She didn't know. She received the bread on her tongue with hands that trembled. The taste was dry, familiar, unimpressive. There was no heavenly sweetness, no burst of divine revelation, no choir of angels emerging from her esophagus. Just flour, air, effort, and centuries of expectation. But still, that glow. Had it been there? After Mass, the villagers shuffled out into the gray morning. Their conversations were small. Crops, aches, children, weather, rumors. No one mentioned the sermon. No one mentioned strange glows. No one mentioned existential dread. Martha approached Ilara, leaning heavily on her walking stick. That sermon was strange, Martha muttered, though her eyes glittered with a sharp intelligence she tried to hide. Priests shouldn't talk like that. Makes people think. Ilara forced a weak smile. Terrible, yes. People thinking. Martha sniffed. "And you? You looked like you'd swallowed a ghost. Are you unwell?" Ilara hesitated, then shrugged. "Just tired." Martha studied her face for a long moment as if reading a very complicated recipe. "Well," she said at last, "sleep more, eat more, pray, sensibly." "Sensibly?" Ilara echoed. "Yes," Martha nodded firmly. "Not too much. Too much prayer bends the mind. Too little bends the soul. Moderation, like salt." She waddled away before Ilara could decide whether that was wisdom or nonsense. The day went on. The sun never fully committed to appearing. The sky remained an indecisive gray. Elara went about her tasks in a blur, her body moving while her mind replayed the same three images: the shadow in her home, the confession in Aldrich's eyes, the flicker of light around the host. Were they connected? Separate? Random? Had something truly happened today? Or was she trying to frame ordinary events with extraordinary meaning because her soul refused to sit quietly in ambiguity? As evening approached, she returned to the river. The water flowed as always, disinterested in theology. She stared at her reflection again, wondering if she could trust even that. "Was that you?" she asked the air. "Or was that just me?" No answer, of course. She picked up a stone and tossed it in. Ripples distorted her reflection, turning her face into a mosaic of doubt. "Was that a revelation?" she whispered. "Or just a trick of hunger and hope?" A breeze brushed her cheek. For a heartbeat it felt like a touch, not warm, not cold, just acknowledging. She laughed softly to herself. "Is that how it is now?" she said. "I beg for clarity, and you give me poetic ambiguity." A leaf dropped into the water beside her stone. They drifted together, spinning slowly. Maybe that glow had been nothing. Maybe it had been everything. Maybe God had nudged the light for a second. Maybe the candle had simply done what candles do. Maybe Aldrich's sermon was merely a man collapsing under pressure. Maybe it was heaven speaking through a cracked window. She didn't know. And somehow, that not knowing was no longer purely terror. It was strangely alive, like standing at the edge of a forest at night, knowing nothing of what wandered inside, but feeling that something, at least, was there. Her fear of priests had changed shape, too. Once, it had been simple. Fear of their authority, their judgments, their words that weighed more than her own. Now it was more complex. A fear not just of their power, but of their fragility, of the way frightened men could wield sacred tools. She realized with a quiet shock that fear of priests was in some way fear of being at the mercy of someone else's interpretation of the unknown. And that was terrifying. Because no one knew. Not really. Not the villagers. Not Aldrich. Not even the shadow that had spoken as if it were both nothing and everything. We are all guessing, she thought. Some with more costume and incense. The revelation, if that's what it was, had not given her answers. It had not said, "This is God," or "This is not." It had not reduced her doubt or erased her confusion or restored her neat, simple faith. Instead, it had done something more dangerous and more honest. It had told her, "You may never know, and still you must live." She sat by the river until the sky darkened, until the first stars blinked awake like reluctant witnesses. She did not pray. She did not renounce. She did not decide. She simply whispered, almost amused, almost resigned, "Very well. If this is revelation, it is brilliantly unhelpful." A faint, ironic smile tugged at her lips, because perhaps that was the most spiritual thing of all. Not certainty, not clarity, but the willingness to keep walking, even when the path refused to label itself. Was today a miracle, a psychological event, a symptom of hunger, a turning point, or just another day in a universe that refuses to explain itself properly? She did not know, but she felt, somewhere beneath the dust and ash and confusion, that something inside her had shifted again. Not broken this time, not shattered, just turned slightly toward a deeper, stranger kind of faith. The kind that breathes in ambiguity, the kind that laughs with doubt, the kind that walks forward even when the light only flickers for half a heartbeat in a priest's trembling hands. And that, perhaps, was the only revelation she was going to get, at least for now. There are endings that feel like endings, clean, folded, tied with theological ribbon. This is not one of them. Some endings are not endings at all, but thresholds pretending to be conclusions, doorways that say stop while quietly whispering come in, moments that look like closure only because your weary mind desperately wants to believe that stories behave like obedient parishioners. Ilara's story had reached such a moment, and it arrived not with revelation or terror or glow or whisper, but with chores, because life inconveniently continues, even when your soul is cracked open, even when your faith is rearranging itself like furniture after an earthquake, even when shadows have spoken truths or lies in your ear. Life insists on continuing, unapologetically domestic. By the third day after her ambiguous revelation in the chapel, after Aldrich's dangerous sermon, after the flicker of sacred maybe light, after the river's quiet refusal to answer, Ilara found herself doing laundry. Yes, laundry. Medieval spirituality has a way of reminding you of your mortality through dirty cloth. She knelt by the river, scrubbing a tunic against a stone worn smooth by generations of believers and unbelievers alike. Water splashed her face, the cold, bitter palms. Her breath rose in pale clouds, and for the first time in many days she felt almost normal, not stable, not certain, but grounded in the familiar ritual of survival. She wrung the cloth, hung it over a branch, moved to the next garment. Her hands worked, her mind wandered. What am I now, she wondered. Devout? Doubting? Something in between? Something new? Something broken? Something becoming? Her thoughts drifted like the river, gliding past memories that felt heavier each time she touched them. Father Aldrich whispering to the well, the shadow's voice describing itself as presence and absence, the glow of the host, the villager's tired eyes, her own name spoken into darkness, and the silence afterward, the heavy, thinking silence. She dipped her hands into the cold water again. Something shimmered. She froze. The river, usually murky, usually practical, usually exactly what it looked like, shifted for a moment, as though a current deep beneath the surface had changed direction. Water swirled gently around her wrists like a ribbon of liquid thought, a trick of light, a reflection, a sign, a prank of nature, a hallucination fed by hunger and hope and exhaustion and existential vertigo. Ilara did not flinch this time. She simply watched, quietly, curiously, a little tiredly. The water swirled once more, then stilled. Ilara exhaled a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. She whispered to the river, "I don't know what that means, you know." A small wave splashed her sleeve in response. She snorted. Very funny. It was unclear whether the river had a sense of humor or whether water, when it chooses, can be sarcastic. Either way, she felt a faint warmth in her chest. Not the warmth of answers, but the warmth of surviving the absence of them. As she gathered the wet cloth, she heard approaching footsteps. She turned to see Father Aldrich standing at the riverbank, robes slightly damp around the hem, eyes darker under the weight of several sleepless nights. "Ilara," he said softly. She nodded. "Aldrich." He hesitated before stepping closer. She could tell immediately that he had come here not to preach, but to unravel quietly beside someone who had seen him crack. "You've been avoiding the chapel," he said gently. "I've been doing laundry," she corrected. "That is a valid theological excuse," he said, lips twitching with reluctant humor. They stood there in silence, the river murmuring between them like a mediator who had heard far too many confessions. Finally, Aldrich spoke again. His voice was tired, but steadier than before. "I fear I said too much," he murmured. "During the sermon, you said the truth," Alara replied, "or a version of it. That is precisely what frightens me." She tilted her head. "Why?" He looked at his hands that had blessed, held, trembled. "Because truth," he said, "makes people seek more truth. And I have nothing more to give." Alara studied him. He looked smaller today. Not physically. He still had the posture of a man told since childhood that he must carry invisible worlds on his shoulders, but spiritually, smaller because a piece of him had cracked open in public. "You are not supposed to give them answers," she said quietly. "Only space to ask." Aldrich blinked, as though the idea had never occurred to him. "You speak," he said slowly, "as if you have discovered something." She smiled, but it wasn't a confident smile, more like a weary smudge of expression. "I've only discovered," she said, "that we know less than we pretend." Aldrich laughed softly, a tired, genuine, slightly broken laugh. "You sound like the Desert Fathers," he said. "Do they do laundry?" "No." "Then I don't sound like them." The laugh cracked fully into a smile, but it faded quickly. "Alara," he said, voice lowering, "what happened that night? The night you changed?" She stiffened. He watched her carefully. She did not want to lie. She did not want to speak truth either. She wasn't sure which was safer, for him or for herself. Finally, she said, "Something came. Or I imagined something came. Or something used my imagination. Or—" She shrugged. "I don't know," Aldrich whispered. "That is the worst and most honest answer I've ever heard." Alara looked at the river. "I'm trying not to make it into more than it was." "And what do you believe it was?" he asked. She touched the surface of the water with her fingertip. Ripples spread. "I believe," she said slowly, "that whatever it wasn't here to save me, or punish me, or teach me, or judge me." She turned to him. "I think it was here to reveal something that is unsettling." "And what is that?" Aldrich asked. She inhaled. "That meaning is not given," she said softly. "It's made." Aldrich's throat worked around a dry swallow. "Alara, do you realize what you're saying?" "Yes," she said. "And no." Then added, "Like everything else lately." Aldrich closed his eyes. When he opened them, the fear was still there, but something else had joined it. Humility, perhaps. Recognition. Or the surrender of a man realizing holiness might be bigger than the walls he prayed inside. "Alara," he whispered, "are you afraid?" She considered the question. Afraid of the presence, of uncertainty, of herself, of Aldrich, of God, of the silence. She touched her chest. "Yes," she said truthfully, "but not of what I thought." "And what did you think before?" "That believing made me safe." "And now?" She met his gaze. "Now I think nothing makes anyone safe." Aldrich exhaled, slowly, deeply. He sank to sit beside her on the riverbank, robes gathering dirt he would later pretend not to see. They sat together, staring at the water. Two souls bruised by revelation and silence. Two humans who had asked for certainty and received ambiguity instead. Two beings alive in a world that refused to sort itself into truths and lies neatly. "You know," Aldrich murmured, "the women in the village, they fear priests. I know. They fear us because we act like we know." Alara nodded. "They fear you because you speak with God's voice." He looked at her. But what if God is whispering something else entirely? Alara dipped her hand in the river again. Cold, real, alive. Then God, she said, has a sense of humor. Aldrich huffed a breath, almost a laugh, almost a sob. They sat there as twilight spread like bruised silk across the sky. The air cooled. The first star blinked awake. And somewhere, far off, a wolf howled, reminding them that the world had always been wild. "Alara," Aldrich whispered, "what do you want now?" She thought for a long time. Long enough for the river to change its rhythm. Long enough for the night to unfurl itself fully. Finally, she spoke. "I want," she said, "to walk into whatever comes next without pretending I understand it." Aldrich nodded, very slowly, as if absorbing the sentence into his bones. "Alara," he said quietly, voice trembling in the cool air, "that might be the beginning of wisdom, or the beginning of madness, or both." But she didn't say that. They rose, walked slowly back toward the village, side by side, but not touching, not aligned, just parallel in their bewilderment. When they reached the crossroads, Aldrich stopped. "Alara," she turned, "if you ever—" He hesitated, then tried again. "If you feel lost again." She raised one eyebrow. "Again?" He cleared his throat. "Yes, again. Many times, probably." She smirked, the first true smirk in days. "You're assuming clarity is coming back." Aldrich smiled faintly. "You're assuming clarity exists." They stood there, exhausted, changed, uncertain. Finally, Alara whispered, "I don't know if God is avoiding us, or watching us, or waiting for us, or laughing at us." Aldrich sighed. "Perhaps God is simply busy." "Busy?" she repeated. "Yes," he said dryly. "Or avoiding messages, like everyone on Mondays." Alara laughed, a real laugh, a bright, startled laugh, sharp as candlelight catching a tear. Then she walked away, not with certainty, not with peace, but with something else. An open ending. A question living inside her like a flickering ember. A story not done with her yet. The night embraced her silhouette as she disappeared into it. Not swallowed, not consumed, just held. The world did not explain itself. The silence did not offer instructions. The shadows did not reveal their author. Her doubt did not resolve. And that, she realized, was the most honest ending she could hope for. For now. Night returned, soft, sprawling, slow, like an old monk slipping back into his robe after wandering too far from prayer. Alara's home breathed quietly in the dimness, its wooden beams exhaling the fatigue of the day. The shutters rattled gently in the cold breeze, and the scent of drying herbs curled through the air like forgotten incense. She sat beside a single candle, the only one she dared to light tonight. Not because she feared shadows, but because she had learned to respect them. The candle's flame wavered lazily, stretching upward as though trying to reach a heaven it didn't fully believe in. Wax pooled beneath it, thick and slow, forming tiny lakes of half-melted certainty. Alara watched it with the quiet attention of someone who finally understands the difference between stillness and silence. Stillness is a choice. Silence is a visitor. Tonight, she welcomed both. The river's murmur drifted softly from beyond her window, a distant echo of time passing and questions continuing, unwilling to settle. Her hands rested on her lap, steady now, not from certainty but from surrender. Not the surrender of defeat, but the surrender of someone who had stopped resisting the truth that there are no clean answers. The presence she had encountered, whether real, imagined, divine, delusional, or deliciously symbolic, had left behind a lingering trace, a faint shimmer in her thoughts like dust caught in half-light. And she realized something quietly profound. The mystery did not need her to solve it, only to witness it. She inhaled slowly. The air tasted of ash, wool, cold stone, the familiar flavors of her world. For a long while, she simply sat there in the soft golden glow, her mind drifting like smoke, her heartbeat steady as a monk's chant. Then, a soft knock. She blinked. Not a knock of urgency, not a knock of danger. Just a gentle, almost polite tap on her window shutter. She stood, shawl draped over her shoulders, and approached the window. When she opened it, cold night air spilled into the room, carrying with it the scent of earth, river mist, and distant chimneys. Stars loomed overhead, tiny wounds of light in the dark flesh of the sky. At her windowsill lay a single feather, not gray this time, not black, not mystical. Just a small, ordinary brown feather. Plain, simple, imperfect. She picked it up. It didn't glow, it didn't hum, it didn't pulse. It was simply a feather. And she smiled. A soft, warm smile. A smile that understood something. Not every sign was a sign. Not every omen carried a message. Not every shadow held a presence. Sometimes the universe sent miracles wrapped in terror. Sometimes it sent shadows wrapped in meaning. Sometimes it sent nothing at all. And sometimes, just to keep things interesting, it sent a feather that meant absolutely nothing. And somehow, that nothing felt like everything she needed. She closed the window gently, feather resting in her palm like a tiny, unimportant truth. She sat back down and placed it beside her candle. The flame flickered. The feather trembled. The room breathed. A prayer, not quite a prayer, rose in her chest. Something like, "Let me walk without answers, and let that be holy." Outside, the wind sighed. Inside, the candle leaned forward, illuminating her face with a quiet tenderness. Her story was not finished, not even close. There would be more nights, more questions, more silences, more symbols that refused to decide whether they were meaningful or mocking. There would be more priests and more fear and more courage to meet that fear. There would be more river mornings, more doubts that tasted like truth, more truths that tasted like doubt. But for now, this night, she allowed herself rest, the kind of rest that comes not from certainty, but from the radical acceptance that uncertainty is its own strange, sacred companion. Her eyes softened. Her breath slowed. The candle dimmed. Dust drifted lazily in the warm air, catching the light like tiny wandering souls. And the night, the vast, inscrutable, ancient night, held her gently in its cool, careful hands. She whispered to the feather, to the flame, to the silence, "I'm still listening." And somewhere in the distance, in a place between imagination and revelation, a whisper, not a voice, simply a feeling, answered, "Good." The candle's flame stretched upward once more, flickered softly, and steadied itself. A final image, a woman, a feather, a flame, a room full of shadows that no longer frightened her, lingered in the air as the night folded itself around her story. And then, gently, the darkness whispered its ironic farewell. If this story kept you awake a little longer tonight, subscribe to Religious Night Stories, where faith never sleeps, even if you do.